Hello, everyone. I'm frequently humbled and touched, motivated and encouraged when people contact me by email or texting or commenting, or they greet me on the street and tell me that my work has been transformative for them. If this has been the case for you, and also if you want to share it with other people, please consider supporting my work by joining my Patreon community. All financial support goes to the Vervaeke Foundation, where my team and I are diligently working to create the science, the practices, the teaching, and the communities. If you want to participate in my work, and many of you ask me that, how can I participate? How can I get involved? Then this is the way to do it. The Vervaeke Foundation is something that I'm creating with other people, and I'm trying to create something as virtuously as I possibly can. No grifting, no setting myself up as a guru. I want to try and make something really work so that people can support, participate, and find community by joining my Patreon. I hope you consider that this is a way in which you can make a difference and matter. Please consider joining my Patreon community at the link below. Thank you so very much for your time and attention.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Voices with Vervaeke. I paused there because I was trying to keep track of all the things I've been doing. This is my third with David Schindler, DC Schindler, and Ken Lowry. This is the second one on my channel. As many of you know, it has been I've been looking forward to this conversation all day. I love talking with Ken, and David has been an intellectual hero of mine, and so being able to talk in this really dialogical manner with him has been a great blessing. So I'm going to just ask each one of you to briefly reintroduce yourself, and then I'll introduce the topic that we're going to discuss. So maybe we'll start with you, Ken.
All right, so I'm Ken Lowry. I've had the honor of being in several conversations now with John, and after a first conversation around a year ago, I started my own YouTube channel, and so that has been a wonderful adventure, getting to meet all kinds of people and explore last time, I think, John, you referred to me as a seeker, and I find that very much apt to how I engage this space. So I am here as a seeker and interested in where we go today.
My name is David Schindler. I go by DC Schindler as a sort of professional name. Originally, it was to distinguish myself from my father, who was a colleague of mine. But he passed away last November. But I think I'll stick with DC as a professional name. It's easy to remember. I teach. I'm a professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the John Paul II Institute, and am particularly interested in ultimate questions. Sort of a generalist. Ultimate questions about the meaning of being, specifically. And especially in relation to the transcendentals, beauty, goodness, and truth, and then the anthropological correlates to those in love and freedom and reason, and to think of all of those in relation to each other, and to think of how they illuminate each other. That's basically what I have spent my life on, and expect to spend the rest of my life on, and of course only scratch the surface of this endlessly interesting question.
So this is amazing. So I was talking off camera with Ken and David about what we would talk about today, and we're sort of supposed to move into these three leaps I'm talking about: the leap into reason, the leap into faith, and the leap into love. And I think we will still end up talking about those, but I want to give us a little bit more tighter context, perhaps a deeper context. So I'm currently reading, and I'm almost done, David's excellent essay, Giving Cause to Wonder, which is a chapter in this book that I highly recommend. If you're interested in reason, you need to read The Catholicity of Reason. It's one of the really important books on reason. And in there, David explores, look, I'll move to a second. Yeah. David, you explore the notion of wonder and its deep relationship to notions of causation. Mm-hmm. And then you do a significant, let's call it something like a rehabilitation of the notion of causation. And then you take it back into Neoplatonic context via Dionysius, the Areopagite. And then you're doing that as, and the person who's the foil for the essay is Heidegger, his understanding of wonder, and he's rolling it into his more general notion of Gelassenheit and releasement and stepping away from causation and stepping away from willfulness. And then you argue basically there's something deeply right in Heidegger because it's trying to get the relationship to God or ultimate reality or the one out of the I don't want to rely on technical terms here, but so ontic. And ontic means sort of within the spatial, temporal, causal network that we understand as the natural world, something like that. Beings. Right. And Heidegger wants us to orient, famously wants us to orient towards being. That is not just the abstract quality shared by all beings or anything like that. It's a deeper, profounder thing, the presencing, the lighting, and all these metaphors that he has. And so Heidegger makes the claim that if we're really going to recover the capacity for wonder and related things like awe, that we need to give up trying to understand being in the same language, the same concepts that we understand beings. And since this is like a Kantian argument too, since cause is a relationship between beings, between things that are already in existence in space and time and having a specific relationship to each other, we can't use cause to understand the relationship between beings and being. That would be a category mistake, which he typically calls ontotheology. Right. And you want to say that Heidegger's argument has some negative sides to it, and it's also mistaken because it has a very limited notion of causation. And if we enrich our notion of causation, we can bring back a positive notion of wonder that is a kind of knowing because it puts us into a proper relation with the kind of causal relation that exists between beings and the grounded being. Is that, I tried to do a lot in a
that's an amazingly succinct, there's a lot going on in that essay, and you managed to tie together the basic themes succinctly. So there's a lot to explore in all that. Obviously, that's the kind of basic parameters. How would you like to open this up?
It's good to hear that I got it right. Yeah. And I don't mean this derogatively. It's a complex argument.
It is,
and so I wanted to, and I've been going through it very carefully, and I wanted to make sure that I grokked it well. And for those
it's the linchpin of the book, as a matter of fact.
So. I think so. I'm glad to hear you say that because I felt everything is turning on this central argument. So, I mean, there's a couple of things I want to talk to you. Eventually, I want to talk to you about awe and wonder and reverence, and the way I think Heidegger doesn't adequately peel them apart and put them in relationship to each other. But before that, let's take this because I mean this is an argument that I have been influenced by, the argument about ontotheology. I know you have a chapter in that specifically, but I haven't read that. So let's just play in this playing field if that's possible. But say whatever you want to say too, which is, I'm going to try and be as neutral as possible. So I'll say something like standard current theism pictures God as the supreme being, as the greatest of things, and is therefore inadequate for understanding what is truly ultimate, which is the ground of being, or being in the Heideggerian sense, which is that which gives everything its presencing, etc. gives it its intelligibility and its presencing to intelligibility, etc. And so classical theism, no, sorry, I'll remove the adjective, current theism, because some people have said, well, classical theism is different, and that's part of what I want to explore with you. But let's say current common, we could even call it sort of standard North American theism, sees God as the supreme being, and that is to make a profound category mistake. That being, no matter how great or grand, couldn't be ultimate reality, couldn't be the ground of the true, the good, and the beautiful, etc. And therefore, it is a fundamental mistake that is ultimately cut us off from being. And this is where Heidegger sort of rolls into the Nietzschean critique, that ultimately leaves us in sort of a nihilistic frame. Now, I believe you want to answer that, and you want to answer that squarely from within a tradition that I have been lately defending at length, which is the Neoplatonic tradition.
Right.
So how's that for an initial setup?
That's a great setup. Yeah. And I mean, I think that the first thing that one needs to say is Heidegger is profoundly right about so much of this critique. And I think it's one of the reasons for his enduring significance in spite of all of the dalliance with Nazism and anti-Semitism. And all those things are actually very important to understand him properly, even if they're not the most immediate thing that one ought to attend to. One needs to try to understand what he's saying first, but those things become very relevant. But he remains of interest to people because I think he speaks to this sense that we have of a kind of absence of any mystery, depth, a sense of the sacred, a sense of wonder, awe, these reverence, these various things that you mentioned, that they are marginalized in our culture. This sort of technocratic culture that we're all familiar with. And so when Heidegger begins speaking about those things, it makes a strong impression. For those who have ears to hear, as Heidegger might say. But the problem is that it seems to me his diagnosis misses the mark on some really fundamental things that require him to present his thought as an alternative to the Western tradition and the Christian tradition. And that one can talk about why that's problematic in various ways, but one of the more immediate implications of his doing that is that it also requires us to it forces us into a kind of an alienation from Western culture and Western civilization, so that in order to enter into the profound depths of things, you have to basically abandon the world as we know it. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but there's something to that. And this has something to do with his flight to the Black Forest and the cabin in the Black Forest and his interest, I think, in at least some dimensions of National Socialism and so forth. But what I wanted to do in that essay is to try to show that one can embrace the critique that Heidegger makes of modern technological thinking, and rather than abandon Western thought simply, enter much more profoundly into Western thought and recognize that there are resources in this tradition that help us to recover the things that Heidegger wants to recover, and ultimately, in a way, I think is more adequate than Heidegger's own offering. So you sort of out Heidegger in one respect, and you remain within the Western tradition. You don't have to invent a kind of a false mystical secondary reality to live what's being proposed.
Okay, this is excellent. Let me pick up on this, which is, part of it is, I think there's not only, an incorrect reading of Christianity. I think you're also making the argument there's an incorrect reading of Plato and the Neoplatonic tradition.
Absolutely, and that's crucially important. And those things go together, by the way.
Yes, I'm not trying to separate them. I'm just
Yeah,
trying
yeah,
to
yeah. No. I didn't mean that as a correction. I just wanted to point that out. Yeah, for the audience here. Yeah.
So, first of all, let's, as you've been suggesting, let's give Heidegger his due. Is it?
Mhm.
And I'm not making you a representative. I'm asking you to just comment as you know, as a deep reflective thinker. Do you think that Heidegger's critique does land on how many people understand God today?
Oh, there's no question about that. I mean, no question at all. Uh, yeah. In fact, I mean, yeah, I think in Anglo-American thought, analytic philosophy, there's, and even, it's interesting, even with very, intelligent and well-educated critiques of certain aspects of a kind of ontic view of God, I think there still is at the root, and one can go way back on this. There still is at the root this idea that God is just, in a way, the greatest being in the world. And one of the evidences of that is that, in fact, I had a long discussion with my students just this morning on this theme. We can't help but think of God's causal presence in competition with the natural realities of the world.
Right.
That if God does something, if things act on their own, that means that God is not acting, and if God is a causal agent, then that displaces natural agency, and that's just, I mean, you can see why one would think that. If you think of agents tend to interact,
they limit each other. That's Spinoza's argument, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Spinoza is an interesting figure on this score, but in any event, it's a very difficult thing to think. I mean, it's. I don't mean that as just a rhetorical throwaway line. It's an extremely difficult thing to think transcendent causality. I mean, there's a way in which, by its very nature, it exceeds what we can think. But we can grasp it by analogy. But that requires a real sort of disciplining of thought and a kind of disposition of a way of life, ultimately, that opens one to see that's not easy to come by.
Okay, that's beautiful. I think you're right. I think that this requires real spiritual exercising before one. I mean,
Yeah.
There's Sanday's stuff about, dialogues like the Parmenides or get like sort of ringing us through this really powerful spiritual exercising. So we stop thinking about the forms as if they're things. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is interesting because this sort of hit me.
May I just add to that?
Yeah,
I mean, this is why I do think Christianity really does need Neoplatonism, because this is a line of thought in Neoplatonism that's really central.
Yes.
I mean, it may be in a way the central theme in Neoplatonic thought. I think one could make an argument for that. And that belonged to the Christian tradition up until the high Middle Ages, the late high Middle Ages, when Christianity and Neoplatonism were put in a kind of opposition to each other, and that's where these problems really start to develop. But in any event, I was interrupted.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say, I mean, I'm really grateful for your work and for this conversation, because, I mean, even before I sort of took up, when I was younger, still within a religious framework, I got struck by something that is not exactly this, but is the precursor to this. So I'm watching the Ten Commandments, right? And is around, usually when I was a kid, it was always playing on TV around early April, around Passover, stuff like that. I'm watching it. And there's the parting of the Red Sea, and everybody's going, and all the people in the room are going, and then, and this is just because of the weirdness of my mind, but my mind thinks, but like in the causation of even the solar system, that's just a minuscule event.
Yeah.
Right. And then I thought, oh, what does that mean? Right. What does that mean about this God? Right.
Right.
And I didn't have any way to process it. So all I was left with was sort of anxiety, which is like, all right. And then, so that is sort of been haunting me. And that's why I have been quite influenced by the Heideggerian ontological critique, because I think it lands very strongly against that sort of conception.
Well, I mean, the classical tradition, when you wanted to find evidence of the presence of God, you would point to the order of the cosmos.
Yes.
And it's interesting. There's a certain strain of Christian, especially modern Christian thinking, that when you want to look for the presence of God, you look for a disruption of the order of the cosmos. That only. And I mean, think about the implication of that point, that God is present only when he's interrupting nature. I mean, that means ontotheology, I mean, that means you're thinking of God as a being that's sort of struggling with and fighting against the natural order, rather than being the principle of the whole thing.
Right. Oh, that's a great insight and connection, David. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Really... I mean, Aquinas is really clear on this. He says he can't. I mean, there's a basic way in which God can't change the course of nature, in a certain respect. Aquinas says, and you think, well, wait a minute, is this some kind of natural fatalism? But his explanation for that is that it's precisely because the course of nature is already an expression of his will.
Yes. Yeah.
And so in a way, it would be a sign of impotence to change. It would mean that his will is arbitrary and not the radical origin of the natural order. I mean, the implications of that are just immense.
So this really starts to shift things in a really important way. So now I want to take up what I think is behind Kant in some way. Sorry, behind Heidegger in some way, which is Kant. Kant gives the famous kind of arguments that causation is something that is part of the grammar of the natural world. It's part of the manifold that we impose on things in order to make sense of them. So trying to extend causation to something beyond the natural world makes no sense. So, well, just if you want to just reply at that point, please.
No, absolutely. I mean, so this is the thing. This is the thing about the critique of causality. So if you associate causality already with a kind of technological thinking,
yes,
and then seek beyond it for some kind of a redemption from that, a liberation, a genuine freedom from that. The problem is that you are, again, I have a lot of sympathy for that, but think about the implication. You end up then abandoning causality to technological thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You see, then the whole world that's governed by causality, which is frankly all of it in a certain respect, ends up being an expression of force and violence and so forth. It's a very different thing if you say, well, let's rather than associating causality with an immanentist sort of thinking, and then finding an alternative, radical, sort of transcendent kind of thinking, that Gelassenheit and so forth as an alternative, let's rethink the meaning of causality. That actually integrates that openness to the transcendent. And then that allows us both to have this genuinely mystical, in the proper sense of the term, sense of transcendence, but that also affects our everyday life and the very natural meaning of things and their unfolding. And I think, I mean, there's not world enough in time for these things, but if you can imagine scientists who embrace a richer, deeper notion of causality and how that would enrich what science means and our capacity to investigate the nature of an atom or something. I mean, these things just would become so gloriously fascinating and rich, because they would all be a manifestation of being and of God ultimately.
Well, that was beautiful. I mean, I've had interacting some of it. I get to interact directly, or like with some scientists like Wolfgang Smith. Maybe it would be helpful to bring in sort of metaphorical schema that he makes use of. He makes a distinction between horizontal and vertical causation.
That's right.
Which I think, and the argument, and I'm not going to repeat all the arguments because I've been releasing videos, one last week on why we really have to bring back a vertical causation that is not just epistemic, but properly part of the structure of reality itself. And so part of what I tell me if this is putting words into your mouth or not, but I think what you're saying is, Kant presupposed that all we meant by causation is this horizontal relation where things are moving each other, because he's enmeshed within the Newtonian scientific Cartesian framework, and that all we mean by cause is making something move, right? And this is and then movement, of course, is dependent on space and time. It can't be ultimate. Cause has to be locked within space and time, and then but then there's this other notion of cause, which is not making move, but bringing forth. I'm trying to. Everything I say can be assimilated into the movement thing, because we've been doing it for 4 centuries. But there's this, the notion of vertical causation that I've been trying to articulate with the axis of emergence and emanation, and the idea that there's a causation that is not like about how things move each other, but how things are present such that they are intelligible to us. I'm trying to go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, Wolfgang Smith is a profoundly interesting, but one thing I would like to ask him at some point, if I ever have the opportunity, is if he sees an analogy. So this would be one of the implications of the argument I'm trying to make in that essay, is that in addition to recognizing sort of an alternative causality to the normal scientific one, to hold on to a connection between those, so that even the horizontal causality will express something of the vertical causality, something of the, and something of that transcendence. And this would be here's a sort of a concrete example of that. In modern scientistic, I don't like that term for a variety of reasons I don't want to get into now, but in the kind of conventional scientific view, you think of causation in terms of the imposition of force.
Yes.
It's one thing imposes a force that brings about some effect, a cause and effect, and so it's essentially dynamic. Rather than saying, okay, no, instead of imposition of force, we need something more generous, like a bringing into being. I would say let's do both. On the one hand, yes, recognize the priority of vertical causality, which is this generous letting be, opening up, allowing to emerge, giving rise to. There's all sorts of language, but then see that that's also operating even when one cue ball hits another one billiard ball hits another. It's not simply force imposing. It's also, there's a kind of communication.
Well, let me try
Okay.
using work I make use of in my work. I make use of Alicia Guerrero. Let's do the 2 billiard balls.
Okay.
Well, why did the second billiard ball move? Well, the first one hit it. Well, why else did it move?
Yeah.
Well, it moved because there were, like, the ground was flat. That actually affords the balls rolling. Both balls have a particular shape that allows them to move. There's air that has insufficient resistance to prevent them, right? And so she talks about not causes between events, but constraints between conditions. And conditions are exactly the things that give. But the thing is, they give, like, the thing about, there's selective and enabling constraints. There's constraints that give more possibilities, make things possible. And then there are constraints that limit those possibilities so you don't get chaos.
Right. To make them meaningful. Right.
Make them meaningful, make them intelligible, make them predictable, make them be something that is communicable. And so one of the ways I try to think about what we've been talking about is to try to get people to step back and take their focus off a relationship between events, and instead take a look at a relationship between conditions. And then when you start to talk about conditions, you can go down to quantum level probability, and you can go up to relativistic. Like, what are laws? Laws are statements of, universal constraints on how things can happen. That's how I would try and introduce the vertical dimension and show how it deeply interwoven with the horizontal dimension.
That's exactly it. And think about there, you're entering into the depth. See, if causation is nothing but transmission of force, then there's nothing to enter into with the mind. It's all opaque, and all you can do is calculate and measure.
Yes.
But once you introduce this other dimension, you realize it's a much meaningful thing. One thing to add too is that motion itself is a form.
Yes, exactly.
That's being communicated, so that the being moved is acquire a kind of participation in a form as well.
Totally.
So all of those things, and now the mind, it's not like people worry that you're mystifying, and when you add these dimensions, but that's not necessarily, you're not excluding the measurable dimension. So those things have their place. It's just that they become part of a much more concrete and layered, textured event in reality.
So two things about that. There's now a considerable movement, and maybe it will achieve consensus within physics. And of course, I'm not a physicist, so but as far as I can understand it, to argue that space and time are not fundamental, that they are in fact also emergent phenomena. So the very things that were the sort of basis for a lot of nominalist thought are now being folded into something from which they. So that is just that, that is a statement of the priority of vertical causation over horizontal causation, if anybody was going to make it, right?
Yeah.
Space and time are emergent. Well, that means that causing things to move can't be the ultimate, right? It can't be the ultimate form of cause. There's this other thing that you're relying on at the heart of your physics. And then another related point is you mentioned measurement. And part of Wolfgang's argument is the measurement problem, which is the measuring device has to be at a different ontological level than the thing it measures, because it has to have a kind of constancy and permanence to it that the flux below doesn't have. You can't measure quantum things at the quantum level. You need something that has a reality. This is his solution, which I think is the only viable solution to the measurement problem. So science is not only pointing, right, to this vertical cause, it's presupposing it in every act of measurement.
I mean, there's several things to comment on there. I mean, just one very brief thing and each one of these could open up into a but just very briefly, I mean, one of the things that I appreciate that has changed my thinking from Wolfgang Smith is his notion of when he makes a distinction between the physical and the corporeal, and I don't especially like that terminology for a different reason. But the very point that there's something normative about the human senses and human perception in the meaning of things, I think that's an absolutely fundamentally important point that needs to be recovered.
Well, I've been making an argument along those lines, convergent with his. I've been making it before I met him, and then he talked, and then I've been trying to develop it. But the argument is any physics that is trying to claim that only the bottom level is real is requiring on scientists at a much higher level, right, reading instruments and making measurements and talking to each other and making claims that could be true. And like, if that is all epiphenomenal and illusory, then it gives us no license for drawing conclusions about the bottom level.
That's right.
There's a sense in which reductionism actually really undermines itself when it tries to get its epistemology, its ontology together.
Yeah. No, and that's, I mean, in the end, that really is an incontrovertible argument. I mean, that absolutely, once you see it, you can't deny it. It's one of those. And before we start recording, I had mentioned that I'd like to pursue at some point with you a conversation about the nature of perception and meaning. But let's put that on the docket for a future conversation. I would really love to hear from you about that. But the other thing that I wanted to comment on in terms of causality and vertical and horizontal, I find incredibly illuminating the contribution of Dionysius, whom you mentioned that I foreground in this essay. One of the things that amazed me was how, and in a way, this is in other Neoplatonists, but I find it so beautifully expressed by him and so succinctly and powerfully, the idea that the language of causality. This is why I sort of took him up in relation to Heidegger. The relation of causality is everywhere in Dionysius. I started circling it. I pulled out the Greek and just found it. Every single page he uses the language of causality.
I read that book, like I've read the book through multiple times, and I do regular Lectio Divina on that book. So I really am.
Yeah.
I'm really trying to.
So you and I really are on the same page with that. I think that it's one of the most extraordinary productions of the human spirit, I think, in history. But anyway, he uses the language of causality, but there's none of it. It's not in the least bit sort of technocratic. I mean, talk about avoiding the ontotheology problem, and this profound sense of thinking is thanking, and reason and reverence and so forth. I mean, that's just pervasive, but he doesn't see that as in tension with the language of causality.
No.
I mean, to the contrary, for him, all causes ultimately come down to goodness and beauty. And so every single cause, insofar as it's causal at all, is causal as an expression of goodness and beauty. And that means that everything that happens in the cosmos is an expression of love. That's what that means ultimately. From the rock rolling down the hill to any sort of natural event.
Let's zero in on that, because I don't want people to just think that's poetry on a Hallmark card. There's an argument being made there.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So let's slow it down, if you don't mind, and let's open it up step by step. So the first is, and you make this point, and I think it's bang on, and it's like, all right, that Dionysius is, and he, contrary to Heidegger, he seems to be well aware of the Heideggerian, of the Aristotelian causes, right? Because he invokes
unquestionably, it's right, unquestionably,
Okay, so but then you make a really cool move, which is, but Dionysius, he's almost like he's looking through the four Aristotelian causes to their original, right? That they, like, if you were to say, so for everybody who's watching, Aristotle's causes are not our notion of cause, because our notion of cause is to transfer force and to make something move, and that's it. So this is kind of a little bit of an undergraduate thing, but it's helpful to not think of the four causes, but rather thinking of them as the four B causes, right? It's like the things you would invoke to explain something and make it intelligible and understandable. But you also have to be pre-Kant. You have to think that means you're discovering something about the nature of something too when you're explaining it. So all of that. So the cause there, of course, there's the one that we thought was an Aristotelian cause, which is the efficient, which is the moving things. But as we've already been talking, that's probably a misreading, because there's a more original meaning that is more like bringing forth, which isn't just making locomotion. I'm trying to think of another name for that other cause. Then there's the material cause, which doesn't mean the same thing as it does for us, because we think of matter as stuff.
Right.
In the ancient world, matter is potentiality, and it's sort of what was the potential that received the form, and that's part of how you explain it. And so potentiality, real possibility, as Urero talks about, because constraints don't shape events, they shape possibility. I do this with my students. I'll say, well, do you believe in scientific laws? Well, where is it? Where is it happening? Does it happen on Tuesdays, right? Where does it happen near Pluto? Right? And wait, it's not an event, right? Okay, and so you've got the material cause, and then you've got the formal cause, which is this structural functional organization that binds all the different aspects of a thing together, so that no matter what we do, it can't become unintelligible to us. It's that through line that, so no matter wherever we stop, we can find how all these aspects are sort of gluing together. It's often pointed to with metaphors of shape, but it's not merely shape. Right? The sort of structural functional organization that binds all the different. So you actually never see the whole of anything in perception, yet you have a sense of its form, right? And that's the formal cause. And then there's the final cause, which is the one that I find most problematic, which is the idea that the reason for which something is done, its purpose or its goal. So for where I find that problematic is, I think that works wonderful for living things. I find that problematic for non-living things.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then I'll just shut up in a sec. And then the idea is, when Dionysius is invoking cause, he doesn't want to talk at that level, right? He wants to, he's pointing, like you said that in a couple different places, like, oh wow, this is important. David's repeating this, right? He's pointing to the cause, if I can put it that way.
That's
right?
Yeah.
So the sense that, so, and just everybody who's watching, the phenomenal, just go to your phenomenological sense right now. The sense of all of those somehow belonging together, and right, and they belong together and they make sense of each other in an interdependent fashion. And realness is your sense of intelligibility in a very, very profound way, right? And so that's what Dionysius is trying to point at, right? What is it that is holding them all together? The good and the beautiful is his answer. So first of all, I just wanted to give that little bit of a tutorial for people who are here, just as, right? And then one more thing, if you put that into something you also make really clear is you're saying, okay, well, this, I don't know, this phusis, this springing forth from this causation, right, is like a giving, but it's also simultaneously a receiving. Okay, now explain that, and then we've got the next move to why love. Because if we got, okay, we've got the, I hope this is working for you, right? You've got the causation, and it's springing forth, phusis, the original meaning is springing forth, and this is an ultimate giving, like, right? But that giving is simultaneously a receiving. It's not a giving and then a receiving. It's
right.
So why that? I know you make an argument. I want to hear you do it. What's the argument for that? And then we have, and this is why you're saying love, because love is where we experience the interpenetration of intelligibility and realness, and the springing forth that is simultaneously a giving and a receiving. That's the move.
There is a lot there. I hope I can do this in a way without drifting into abstractions. I'm hoping I can stay concrete with this. But the first thing to say is it all turns on the affirmation of goodness as the nature of the first cause, the first principle, the or cause. And one could give an argument for that, but I don't want to try to throw too many arguments out at once. But recognizing that the original cause, that from which all things proceed, is good and generosity, it means that every effect, one of the implications of that point is that every effect is a reception of goodness. It's a response to goodness. It's somehow a result of goodness and a response to it. And in the classical tradition, that's the very definition of love. Eros is precisely the reception of goodness. So here you have a cause as good, and the effects are the receptivity to goodness, which is to say that the effects are love, are eros, the things that they are insofar as they desire the good, you might say. And now this again, this sounds like a Hallmark card or a very sophisticated Hallmark card maybe, but I mean, this is the classical Neoplatonic tradition. This has been worked out in detail, that the very nature of things, because they're caused by the good, is love, is eros. Now, what Dionysius does is he deepens that, and he recognizes if it's the case that the being of things is their reception of their cause, which is their reception of goodness, which is their love that they are. If that is if that's what they are, then what they are, what they receive in receiving themselves, is nothing other than the good. So in receiving the good, as he says, they become good-like.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so now you have a whole chain of things. You have goodness as cause, you have eros as effect, but eros precisely is reception of goodness, and reception of goodness is now image of the good,
Yes.
being like the good. Now, what is the nature of the good?
To give.
To give.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now, so insofar as things receive themselves, they are, you might say, I mean, to put this in a somewhat simpler way, they're receiving the very capacity and inclination to give themselves.
Yes, yes, yes.
And that means that reception and generosity are flip sides of the same coin at this deep, deep, deep level.
Yes.
Now that means that the good that is pure generosity, if generosity and reception and receiving are flip sides of the same coin, that allows us to think of God as pure generosity, as also in a certain sense pure reception, receptivity. So now what does that mean? That means, as Dionysius points out, and this is I mean, this sounds very abstract, but once you start to put the pieces together, you realize it has to be. This really is the only way to really make sense of reality. That means when God causes the world, it's not in the form of an imposition of force.
Yes.
It's not a simple sort of transitive action acting on.
No.
And that's what Heidegger was most concerned about in Christianity, was precisely.
But to be fair to him, a lot of people have that sort of artisan image or understanding of God.
Yeah, almost everybody. I mean, that's I mean, no, he's not making this up. I mean, this is omnipresent, but it's not present in Scripture. I mean, how does God cause grass on the earth, vegetation on the earth? He doesn't like magically put it on the earth. He calls it forth. God causes the vegetation by allowing the earth to produce it. You know, so you see, in a way, you could say that God's causing the vegetation is his reception of the vegetation from the earth, and that's how God and that's the only way to think of causality as generous.
So this point reminds me a lot of Erigena. And your argument about the complete interpenetrivity of
from below and from
above. And the receptivity and the giving, right? And even the most every moment of generation and generativity and generosity, and those are all related terms, right? Has to have a corresponding moment, and I'm not using this in the time sense, I'm using it, the closest is in phenomenology, has to have a moment of receptivity. And so in Erigena, you have this complete interpenetration of the emanation and the emergence. Like it's not, it's the polarity, it's never the poles, right? It's all the way through.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you're right. I mean, then you realize, I mean, you know, to be is to receive, is to give, is to be again. And life is a deepening of these relationships of love. And what you want to say is then that every causal event in the cosmos, insofar as it's productive at all, and if it weren't productive, we wouldn't use the language of causality. Insofar as it's productive at all, it's an expression of the original causal generosity at the root of things. And that's why you can then interpret, you know, Aristotle's four causes. This is, you know, Dionysius and the Neoplatonic. I mean, Plotinus does this already. But you know, they really do bring together Plato and Aristotle, and you realize that each of the four causes can be interpreted as an expression of the or cause, which is the good. And these two figures come together then.
You see, because I think there's an argument to be made here, but I'll just express it intuitively.
Sure.
I also think of the good as the cause, like this through line, right? Not the through line, but the continual keeping of the promise of the through line is
Mhm.
the good of intelligibility, right?
Mhm.
Right? That intelligibility presupposes that the next aspect won't fall off into cacophony or chaos, right? That no matter how we unpack reality, right? Intelligibility just unpacks with it.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So there's
And
something.
then that
Go
means
ahead.
that means that part of thinking is trusting in this way and being open to the discovery. I mean, and that's the thing, you know. And here we get to wonder.
Yes.
But this is why you already need to know in some respect in order to be properly surprised by what's new.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a kind of you know, Heraclitus had said this at the origin of philosophy, that unless you expect the unexpected,
Yes.
you won't be surprised by it. You won't notice it.
And that has a lot to do with beauty. Beauty is something that is in some way unexpected, but nevertheless immediately discloses its intelligibility. It's sort of surprising, like Skari talks about this in her book on beauty. You see the beautiful tree. I didn't realize trees could be like that, but it doesn't mean that it shatters all your understanding of. It somehow weaves back and then reconstitutes your understanding of trees. Right? It's this.
Who's the author? Who's the author?
Oh, Ellen Skari. She has a book. Here it is. Wow, that's convenient, eh?
Yeah.
Here it is. It's called On Beauty and Being Just. Ellen Skari.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
See?
Okay.
Again, one of these little thin books that's a gem. And that idea, that beauty isn't horrifying, incommensurable, in something that is just unintelligible. It unfolds, and yet it gathers everything that has led up to that moment, but not in an inferential way. It's this weird insight, recapitulate it. And this is why Plato was so invested with this metaphor of anamnesis. It's somehow like we're simultaneously discovering and remembering at the same time, which is the profound thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard to in one respect, it's hard to figure out what that could possibly mean. It seems like a paradox and a contradiction even, but in another respect, we have experiences of it all the time.
Yes, I mean,
and you intuitively you can kind of you sort of see that it makes perfect sense. Actually,
people say things. I mean, so when we do for example, when we do the Circling into Dialogos workshops, people say this reliably.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered a kind of intimacy I didn't know existed that I've always been looking for. And they don't realize the paradox of what they're saying.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it is. I mean, and the fact of the matter is, if you neglect either side of that it really is a discovery. So there really is an encounter with something new.
Yes.
But it's not new in a kind of banal empirical sense. It actually is a novelty that you recognize was always present, was already there. And both sides of that, however much intention they are, that they need to be preserved for the whole experience.
I think that means that wonder is deeply bound up with insight, because that's the machinery of insight, right? Insight is always inventio. You see the aspect that discloses something that was always there, but was absolutely novel to you because you get the flash of the insight. So let's hold on to that. That's wonder. But before we get into wonder, like I want to just, because there was a passage when I was reading Dionysius that I just stopped, and I was doing Lexio on it too. It just reverberated, and I made notes, and I was thinking about how could we turn this into a practice. But he talks of, and then you did a translation of it in your book, which is like a much more literal and therefore, thankfully, a much better translation. But it's this idea, and this is where I want to get back to that weaving of the horizontal and vertical. Okay. It's about, right? It's about once you have this model, because he talks about, Dionysius talks about, the love we have that draws us upward, right? The love for God which transcends us, and then the horizontal love of that which accompanies us, right? And then the downward love, right? That which And what's interesting, and I think you make a very good point, and I think this is one of the great gifts of Christian Neoplatonism, is it takes the emphasis off just the ascent as being the only thing that is the arc of realization in both senses of the word. But no, it's actually this, and this that is actually love, and all of those dimensions matter. I just wanted to, again, because we were talking about weaving the vertical and the horizontal together.
No, and it does all that without attenuating the ascent of eros. I mean, so you have the, but it's, I mean, it's this, and the question arises, that's very clear and explicit in Dionysius, and so you wonder, well, is this the Christian difference that has the incarnational entry into the world and into the flesh and into the finite and so forth? But you realize once you see it in Dionysius, you go back and you see, well, wait a minute, this is already in a way in Plato, and it's already Plotinus. I mean, in a way, it's a novelty, but it's a novelty that brings out something that was already present. Just to recapitulate that theme, it's that dimension of it is pretty striking.
That is generous, and I think fair of you to say, because there's a temptation amongst Christians to always make Christian Neoplatonism a sort of, a one-up or something like that over the tradition. And I agree with you. I tend to think that, but I'm influenced by you, so I'm biased. I mean, Plato's critique of impure reason. I think Plato is very careful to try and counterbalance the up and down. Right?
And again, it's one of those things. It's on the surface, it doesn't seem like he is, but then you get these weird notes that don't make sense. But once you actually accept that as the interpretive key, then suddenly all these otherwise odd notes just fall right into place.
Yeah, I mean, I think Plato I think Plotinus has it, but I think he is skewed because of his understanding of the bottom as evil, inherently evil. Which I think very problematic.
That complicates things.
It complicates things. So, but I'm wondering, now, can we bring it into the phenomenology, and this will start to layer it with wonder. So there's a transcendence up. That's very that's even what the word going up over the mountain kind of thing, right? But Ursula Goodenough has talked about a transcendence into, which to me feels very much like this.
Yeah.
And other people, they don't use the word transcendence, but they're trying to do something that has almost an as much axiological input. They talk about grounding, grounded things, and so I'm trying to get people to see. But wait, we're not just talking abstract. You have these movements. You have these movements of spirit, right? You know what this feels like. But I think Ursula Goodenough, like when you really transcend into something, there's that, and then there's that other sense of there's, you want to almost say transcendence downward, right? But that sounds weird. But I'm trying to get people to remember in the deep sense, sati, remember that no, you know what we're talking about. You know what these feel like.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one could get very concrete. There's a kind of an ecstatic sense of being lifted out of yourself. But I mean, it's also the case in doing a task. I remember having a conversation because I was sort of really kind of tortured by some of these questions when I was in graduate school, and I spoke to my mentor, Eric Pearl. He was very much my mentor in graduate school. He's extraordinary, and
Theophany is one of the best books. When people say recommend an introduction to Neoplatonism, I say read Eric Pearl's Theophany.
That's exactly. I do the same, but I have to say, hearing it in class is reading it is not the same thing. There really is some. But anyway, I asked him once about that, and he basically he made some comment about he's never the most philosophical act that he experiences, changing his baby's diaper. You know, and I mean, you think about there, talk about, you know, I mean, in a way, it seems like the opposite. And, you know, he was being provocative in saying it, but what he meant was, you know, there's a sense in which you really are brought out of yourself
Yes.
in a profoundly concrete way that um, anchors and renders concrete the ecstatic transcendence that can, you know, without such a grounding, can actually become a kind of self-deluded,
Yes.
I'm transcending myself, but what I'm really doing is looking at my belly button, you know, and being happy inside myself, kind of oblivious to the world. And
Yeah.
that's, of course, an illusion. Yeah.
Yeah. Spiritual bypassing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so for me, you know, Taoism has got this transcending into feel to it. Like when I'm in the form and I feel like I'm reciprocally opening with the world, and we're in partnership together. It has this, and it's and if anybody says, well, that's not as profound as this, I'll just say, no, I don't think so. I've also had, you know, this kind of mystical experience, but I've also had this kind of, Buddhism is very good, profoundly good at this, you know, like sink to the depths in a profound way.
Can I just connect all this also with the experience of beauty? I find you really do get all of these dimensions in an experience of beauty. That I was marveling at that the other day. That, you know, when you experience something beautiful, does it bring you out of yourself into the thing, or does it send you into your own depths? And I realized the answer is yes.
Yes.
You know,
I get that.
mm-hmm.
I get this deep reciprocal opening, but I also get I don't know, it's like, well, it's a wonders. How did this emerge? How could this have come? And then I also get often an ecstatic thing is, well, what is, like, you, like, in the right, and I'm really trying to play on this. What does this signify? What is this a living image of? What is this plug into beyond itself?
Yeah.
You know, like in the symposium, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I don't know.
I get all of them typically. In like in a very, like when I encounter profound beauty. What's really interesting is when that beauty is in a person, because all of those dimensions, and phenomenologically you can pick it up, and I don't mean anything graphic or distorting about it, but, you know, if it's for example, I find my partner beautiful, of course, like this reaches down into my embodiment in a profound way.
That's right.
But then there's a disclosure of her mystery, which is horizontal, but then there's she is one of my profoundest icons. I don't want to say image, profoundest icon of what I mean when I'm trying to talk about beauty per se.
Yeah, no, and you know that, I mean, that's the thing, you know, the difference between responding to beauty of a person in a purely bodily way. I mean, we know what that is like. And then a real, you know, that's as one of my students, undergraduate students, explained, that's the difference between saying that someone is beautiful and saying that person is hot.
Yes.
I thought,
that
captures it, right? Yeah, but what's odd is that you wouldn't say then experiencing the person as beautiful in a way neglects the body.
No,
I mean, quite the contrary. I mean, that's the thing that's extraordinary is actually it's simultaneously much more. You know, you'd say, well, is it a spiritual experience or is it a bodily experience? And you just can't distinguish them. They become so deeply intertwined.
Well, I would say it's simultaneously a spiritual experience and an embodied experience. And I'm trying to hear this in a Hegelian manner. It's also a social experience of reciprocal recognition that is a profoundly important thing too, a grounding of rationality, of normativity. Like all of that is in play
at once. Yeah, right. And that's why I think it's important to see beauty as, you know, I think it's the most comprehensive of all of these dimensions, and that the experience of beauty therefore sort of opens up the context within which then you have your distinct acts of intellect and will.
I just realized I don't have my power bar, and we're going to lose.
Oh.
So I'm just going to pause for 1 sec.
Okay.
So sorry for that little glitch. We're back, and I think this is a very good opportunity for. I mean, the problem is I've been talking to David. I've been talking to you about your essay, and so that's been sort of back and forth trying to. And I definitely don't want to suddenly startle Ken in the headlights or anything like that. But I would like to open things up. I mean, a general question is what might this kind of, I think we're getting into genuine dialogos. I feel like the conversation's taking on a life of its own and the insights are sparking back and forth. But what would this kind of dialogos mean to a seeker, as you describe yourself?
It's so difficult to put into words the kind of thing that I experienced over the last hour listening to this, right? Because it felt as if I was moving through this space, you know, where as you were both speaking, these kinds of, I don't like to use the word machine, but it's like these like living things, right, would come together and play in a way that I've had many times before, but like the continual emphasis on the grounding into embodiment was really, I felt it really profoundly, because as I was listening, I was trying to do that. I was trying to do all of it as it was happening, and that, I think the key moment for me that I felt like, oh, okay, here's where I can really hold on to it, was this trusting to the through line of intelligibility, right? Trusting that it will continue to lay itself out to me, even though, right, it's almost like it was happening. It's happening so fast, and I don't have the context to hold it all, right? So it's like I see the things come up, and then I see them go by, and I have to let them go, but to trust that it's going to keep going in a way that is not some kind of flight.
That's one of the helpful things about the organic metaphor, is that, you know, a mechanical thing, it's either there or gone, you know. But when you begin to think of thinking in terms of a richer sense of causality and relationship and involved trust and love and these kinds of things in organic metaphors, you realize you can come to a certain insight that you yourself are not fully capable of articulating, but it's there and it stays with you, and it takes, and over time begins to unfold. I have that experience very frequently, that thoughts that have been there in this kind of, in the back of my mind, will just suddenly unfold a new dimension of their own, you know, like sort of on their own, from their own resources in a way. It gives you, I think even that just gives you a special insight into the nature of the human spirit.
I think that's well said. And for me, I've been arguing that spirit we find in the guts of our insight and intuition and inference, right, is I think it shares the same grammar with reality. I mean, and that sounds like a Hallmark card too, but I have lots of talks out there where I have gone through some very careful scientific and philosophical argument. Ken, I wanted to also get your feedback, because what you just said was tremendously helpful. First of all, I heard what you're saying and you're able to something, but also constantly bringing this into the phenomenology and getting ways in which you can imaginally enact it seem to be helpful in a way. So that's, you're nodding vigorously, so that's good to know. And then I wanted to know, like, there's one sense in which this whole thing has been a proper appreciation and reply to Heidegger's critique of ontotheology about God as the greatest thing.
Mhm.
Did you find that? Because I'm not just asking to draw something. Because when you were doing that, you were moving around quite a bit, and your eyes were at times quite. What was happening for you when we were talking about that?
Yeah.
I think that kind of ontic view of God as the greatest thing is something that I've struggled with a lot. Because like as you both referred to, it's so pervasive.
Yeah.
And it was fundamental to me for a long time. And then there's been different points at which I more or less feel as I'm floating as I try to let that go. But I find that, I'm more torn apart if I try to hold on to it. And so over the past while, that has been distanced for me a little bit conceptually, but trying to find how to bring it down and not have the attempt to engage with the ground of being as just kind of being this, right? Trying to bring it down into the horizontal is it's harder.
Yeah.
And so I think making those really kind of explicit ties, I mean, a lot of it, I just listened to your talk on leveling up from Greg Enrique's conference.
Conference, yeah.
Yeah. And that was really helpful for me in the background to kind of get this sense of how, like, we're talking about two kind of superimposed, this grammar of intelligibility correspondence between the mind and reality. I think there was just a lot of that happening for me in a way that, and it was so perfect that Eric Pearl's quip of the most philosophical thing he does is change his baby's diaper, because for me, I'm in this place where I have my first child and I'm playing with her, and I'm like, well, specifically, I want to go and read your book, Freedom from Reality, right? I want to go and read that book, but here I am playing with my daughter, and it's this continual, right? Like, there's a time and there's a place.
There's reality.
Yeah. And so yeah, I don't know if that does justice, but
it's good. It's very good. You were very generous and you said, like, you want me here, and I said yes, I really do want you here. And it may have seemed like I didn't mean that the way that conversation was just rolling, but I don't want you to be. I don't want you to be the audience. I'm hoping you'll be more like the Greek chorus. I'm hoping that you'll do much more, because I want to know how and why this will land with people that are like you, intelligent, good faith seekers. You're climbing Mount Sophia, as you put it, and I want to make sure, and I sense from David that he does too, that what we're doing when we do this stuff that's conceptual, philosophical, I don't know what word to put on it that doesn't sound backhanded, but anyways, when we're doing that, is I don't want it to lose, and Plato didn't want it to lose, and Dionysius doesn't want it to lose touch with the transformation of individual and collective life. I think that for me, that so I hope you feel that my questions are welcoming you into this conversation in a valuable way. Because that's how I'm appreciating it.
Yeah, no, I'd like to echo that, and also, that the speculations are meant to I mean, in a way that it's precisely the point of it is to enter more deeply into reality, not to find some sort of escape. But the other thing is that for me is very important, is to recognize that these criticisms of ontotheology and respect for what Heidegger does, that doesn't imply then an abandonment of faith. You know, I think for a lot of people, that seeking means, in order to be a real seeker, it means you have to let God go. And you know, that actually might be a moment at some point, but it's not the case that adhering to God means you can't be a seeker, or vice versa. That in fact, I mean, to the contrary. And
Yeah.
that's you know, Augustine had some line about that, you know, the more we understand about God, the more we realize how much, you know, it's the standard thing. You realize there's infinitely more. You're increasingly aware of how far you are away from it, and how infinite the depths of what there is still to understand. It never comes to an end.
Yeah, I've found that to be so true. And but it's the trusting to that through line, I think, that is what's allowed that to be true for me. Is that, like, I think one of the turning points for me was realizing that all truth is God's truth. But to go back to what you were saying, John, and first of all, thank you very much. That's kind of you. And you know, I think there's something about the posture that you're both doing this with, that there's never a question as to whether or not you're wanting to go more deeply into reality. Like I've never questioned as in both of your work, I've never questioned whether or not this is actually going to make me better at my day-to-day job of caring for patients, or at my, you know, at the moment of caring for my child, right? It's the desire to go read the book. It's actually the book itself that turns me back to not go read the book. You know? and so I think that is so deeply affirming, because I think for so long, part of what makes me who I am is who my parents were. And my parents had a tremendous commitment to follow what they thought was the good.
Yeah.
But they didn't have resource that took them to a place that was actually helpful. And so I think so many of us have been yearning for and looking for something that we can sink our teeth into, that will actually, you know, take us into the depths of reality, but in a way that, you know, we can actually still live our lives. We can still have jobs that are just kind of doing normal things and raise families, but still have something meaningful that's not just kind of hand wavy.
Yeah, that's really fundamentally important to me.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Ken. That really was inspiring for me.
Yeah, I because of my natural social phobia, I'm very easily tempted to become a hermit. And then I can fall prey to a kind of spiritual bypass, and that's also, I think, ultimately vicious. So one of the reasons why I've been trying to reach out and make connection both ways to similar-minded thinkers like David, and to similarly seeking people like you can, is precisely because I think making that connection is what, in fact, part of what I'm going to argue is it's even more urgent now than it was even 5 weeks ago. We're now in a place, I think these machines, and I won't talk about that right now, but because I'm going to do that in the essay, the video essay. But I think this is maybe one of the greatest kairos that humanity is going to face. That is my study conclusion about this. I think both the people who are making the prophecies of doom and the people who are promising unending utopia are off in important ways, because they usually are. But I don't think this is, I think this is very, very significant. This is going to represent a challenge to us in a really profound way. And so I think one of the best things we can offer is a way of bringing the profundity of And Socrates would have wanted this, of bringing the profundity of the Platonic tradition into the agora.
Yeah.
We have to. And it's
Yeah.
so the urgency for that is extreme now. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I do
I'm
need.
actually going to need to go here.
Yeah, me too.
But that was such a great final statement there, and again, inspiring. I just I think this is an important work, and the world's, yeah. Well, I don't want to. We're grateful for what you're doing, John.
Well, I'm grateful for your work, and I'm grateful for our friendship, and for Ken, for you linking this and making this happen and affording it, being in the right context. So I'm just going to end by saying thank you both very much, and of course we're all going to talk again. That goes without saying.
Very good.
Thank you.